Today, we're going to squash and stretch some text using the mesh warp effect. Now, the mesh warp tool is a distortion effect similar to the puppet pin tool, but instead of placing pins around your canvas, we instead get an amount of rows and columns to set up a grid system, which we can later distort instead. Okay, let's get going. First, right-click in the project panel and go to New Composition. I'm going to call this composition Squash and Stretch. And for this tutorial, I'm going to set the width and height to 1000. Make sure you've got the pixel aspect ratio set to square pixels and set the frame rate to 24. For the duration, we're just going to make that 6 seconds. Hit OK. Next, I'm going to set up my own guidelines by using the rulers. Now, if you don't see these, if you hold Ctrl-R, it will toggle them on and off. And I'm just going to grab from the side and drag out to 100 pixels. You'll see it on the top here. And then I'm going to go out across again to 900 pixels. And then I'm going to bring 2 down, again to 100, and again to 900. So you have these little squares in each corner. The idea being that the text is going to fit inside this boundary. Once that's all set up, click Ctrl and T to bring up the text tool, or you could click on the button in the layer panel at the top. And then if we click into our canvas, we can type our first word. And I'm going to type squash. Just going to deselect that by clicking the selection tool at the top. Then I'll just move that to fit within my guides. Now, I'm using the Anton typeface. You can use any typeface that you like. The aim is to get the words sitting flush in between the guides. You can edit the text from this properties panel, or if you don't see that, you can also tweak it in the character panel on the side as well. If for whatever reason you're not seeing that, if you go to Window, you can find character here. By cycling through the hotkeys V and H, I can go between the selection tool and the hand tool. The hand tool just allows you to move around your canvas freely by holding down the mouse button and then dragging it. And then if I switch to V, you can move the text. And those tools just correspond to the top toolbar here. But if you can learn the hotkeys, it'll save you a bunch of time. Once that's in position, I'm going to navigate over to the layer panel, make sure that squash is selected, click Ctrl and C to copy it, and then Ctrl and V to paste it. I'll drag it down. But as I'm dragging it down, I'm going to hold Shift to lock it into place. When I don't, it'll veer off to the side. By clicking Shift, it just holds it to an axis. You can also get to the hand tool by holding the middle mouse button if you have that option. That'll help you navigate the canvas quite easily as well. And now I'm going to double click into this second layer and type out AND. I'll then move over to the selection tool. And again, I'm just going to tweak the size of this text so it fits in between the guides that we've set. Just using the arrow keys on my keyboard to finesse it a little bit. And then again, just going to bring it down. Now, this text is very tall, much taller than I'd like it to be. So I'm actually going to reduce the size of it with scale. If we go back to our layer panel, click and then S on our keyboard, it'll bring up the scale option. Now, we want to decouple constrained proportions. And that just means that we can scale it on either axis without it being joined together. So I'm going to reduce the height, which is the second number, to 64. And then I'm going to move that back up. After that, I'm going to duplicate the squash text again. I'll move this to the bottom, and then I'll double click the layer and type stretch. I'll then head over to the font size, just reduce that down so it sits within the boundary. And then I'm just going to boost up the and so it sits flush between the squash and the stretch, and the spacing is similar on each side. I'm just going to click Ctrl and S to save, just in case After Effects decides to crash and we lose all our work. It's nice to prevent that. And then there's one final thing that we want to do before we get animating, and that is selecting all of our layers. You can do this by going to the layer panel, clicking either the top or bottom layer, holding shift, and then clicking the top. And we're going to group them together in a pre-comp. And you do this by clicking Control Shift and C. And I'm just going to call this Squash and Stretch Pre-Comp. I've got Move All Attributes into the new composition ticked and Open in a new composition too. I'll hit OK on that. And then everything has been grouped in this new composition. I'm just going to exit out of the new timeline we've created and go back to the previous one. And whilst I'm at it, I'm just going to tidy everything into a sequences folder. I'm quickly going to make a black background for this. So I'll get my rectangle tool. The shortcut is Q. Or you can go to the top and click this here. I'm just going to drag it across my canvas. Now, this is actually a very common mistake that'll happen when you're using any kind of shape tool. So because I had my composition selected, instead of dropping a shape layer onto the canvas, it's created a mask, and that's not what we wanted to do. So I'm going to click Control and Z. We're going to deselect our layer panel. And if we're going to have the shape tool, you'll actually notice that we've got a fill and stroke option at the top. The fill will let you change the color of your shape. Hit OK, and then drag over the canvas. You can see it's red. But with that shape layer selected, you can actually go back up to fill and you can change this color to anything you want. For this tutorial, I'm just going to keep it black. I'm going to drag that shape layer underneath my text layer. And with it selected, if I click enter, it'll allow me to rename it. And I'm just going to call it background. Then with nothing selected in the layer panel, I'm just going to click U. And that'll tidy everything up. Now it's time to use the mesh warp effect for this next part. You can actually get to that in a couple of ways. The first is by selecting the layer that you would like to use the effect on, going to the effects button at the top, scrolling down to distort, and going across to mesh warp. Or the way that I like to do it is to head over to the effects and presets panel and then simply type in mesh into the search box and grab it there. Then, if you left click on it and hold, you can drag it over to the layer that you want to apply it to. In this case, the Squash and Stretch pre-comp. Let it go, and you'll now have a grid structure across your entire canvas. To help me with this effect, I'm actually going to drag another guideline out to the center, a vertical line, and a horizontal line. And I'm going to use the guides to help me get that in the middle. Then I'm actually going to go over to the mesh warp effect and set the rows and columns to 3. We're going to click this little stopwatch called distortion mesh, and that's going to drop our first keyframe. If we go back over to our squash and stretch pre-comp and click U again, you'll see that we've got a little keyframe here. We're going to move 12 frames along. Now I'm going to select where the lines intersect on this row, and I'm doing that by holding shift as I click across them. That just means I get to select everything. Then when I hold any of these and drag down, I'm going to drag them to that middle guide that we set before. I'm then going to click on the next row without shift selected. Then I'll hold shift, click the next point, point after the point after that. And again, I'm just going to drag this down. I'm happy with that. I'm going to click on the new keyframe that we just made, Control and C, then move to 1 second into the composition, Control and V to paste that keyframe. I'm going to move along another 12 frames. And then I'm going to take the point of the first row and I'll move those up. I'll go for the points in the second row and I'll move those to the guide we set earlier. I will again Control C that keyframe, move to 2 seconds, and then paste. And then I'll go to our first keyframe, Control C, Control V to put it back. And our text successfully squashes. It's a similar trick to get it to go the other way. make sure the mesh warp effect is selected to bring up the guidelines. And this time, instead of clicking the rows, we're going to click down the columns instead. Left clicking where the points intersect, holding Shift, and clicking down the rest of the column, and dragging those to the middle guideline. We'll repeat the process on the second column. Copy that keyframe, paste it 12 frames along, move 12 frames forward again, and then repeat the process. One more time, into the center, copy and paste those keyframes, and then I'm just going to move those keyframes along, grab this and copy and paste it in so there's a bit of a break. There we go, we have the basis of our squash and stretch animation. Just going to put the final keyframe in there, which is just a repeat of the starting keyframe. Now, the current movement of the animation is very linear, it's quite robotic, and we want to smooth it out slightly. So with the final keyframe selected, I'm going to hold Shift and grab the rest, and then I'm going to hit F9 to easy ease them. And that's essentially creating a speed ramp where it goes slow to fast to slow again, rather than a constant speed throughout the entire animation. But we can have even more control over this. So with all of the keyframes selected, we can go to the graph editor. Then if we select all of our points on the bottom, we can actually drag them out and we get a slightly punchier effect to really take it to the extreme. But I'm going to rein it in a little bit. I'm just going to click out of the graph editor. There's one final thing that I'd like to do for this animation. I actually want the animation to be a little more constrained and feel like it's more set within the boundaries that we've created. I'm going to do that by dropping some position keyframes. So with our squash and stretch pre-comp layer selected, if you click P, it'll bring up the position keyframes. If you hit the stopwatch, you'll drop a keyframe, move along 12 seconds. I'm just going to move this up. Now, I want it to be so when the text is being squashed, it's not moving past the boundary. So that's going to be my focus. I'll paste that keyframe. Then when we go to the top, I'll just drag this down, just finesse it with the arrow keys to make sure that this is flush on the top. Copy and paste. And then reset it at the bottom. And then I'll do the sides. Just copying and pasting that starting keyframe again. And then I'm going to easy ease everything by selecting everything and hitting F9 one more time. Going back into the graph editor. Selecting everything, just making it a little punchier again. And there you have a squash and stretch animation. Now, there is another way that you can get the text to squash down. I'll show you how I've done that here, where the and stays the same size. If I click U on my layer panel, it'll bring up these keyframes to reveal what I've actually done. All that's happening with and is the position is animating, and stretch and squash are animating in the scale. But the clever thing about this is the anchor point for stretch is set to the bottom in the middle, and the anchor point for squash is set to the top in the middle. So when you adjust the scale, it adjusts from that point. I'm just going to hide these layers, and I'll show you how the anchor point tool works. So I bring this close to the center of my composition. You'll see that the anchor point, this little crosshair, is close to the center at the bottom. Now, if we click Y to bring the anchor point tool, or even go to the anchor point tool at the top on the toolbar, you can drag this around. If you hold Control and double click the anchor point tool, it'll move it flush to the middle. Now, holding Shift will lock this in place if you go side to side, or if you decide to go up or down. And that's very quickly how you can set your anchor point. So if I go to Scale again, and I decouple the Constraint Proportions button, and I toggle the height, you get this effect. Setting a center anchor can help out a lot when you are setting up a composition. If you go to Align, you actually have buttons to align things horizontally and vertically. Now that text is dead in the center, and you can also do fun little things with loading bars. So if I go to my shape tool or click Q, for example, I drag out this box, I can very quickly Control double click on the anchor point tool to get the anchor point in the middle, Shift click to drag it to the side, and then if I go to my scale options and decouple Constraint Proportions, toggle from the side, you have the basis for what is essentially a loading bar animation or a lower third reveal. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If it has been genuinely helpful for you, it'd be great if you would consider liking it and then even subscribing to the channel, as that'll push me in the YouTube algorithm, meaning I get to do more of this kind of content. Thank you.